if the industry doesn't understand what its culture needs to be and what its purpose is, then frankly, it needs to ask itself some pretty tough questions.
Hello and welcome to this special video interview for Last Word Media and Bond Hill's campaign for better governance. I'm speaking to Shiv, Taneja, CEO of the Fund Boards Council in the UK, a membership organisation for directors of mutual fund boards to promote excellence in fund governance. Thanks for joining me, Shiv. I have lots of questions for you.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we launched the campaign for better governance a few months ago as we felt that the investment industry needed to take a closer look at the activities and behaviour within its own space and ensure that as an industry that is looking after society's pensions and savings, that we are doing the same that we are asking of the companies that we invest in, whether that is from a diversity or culture perspective or even an ESG perspective. I don't want to sound like I'm accusing groups of anything or individuals, but we just felt that there was something that needed to be addressed within the industry. So with that in mind, what have been the key issues that the Fund Boards Council has been focusing on recently?
Well, firstly, can I just say that I'm really pleased to see that you're doing this campaign or that you've launched this campaign, because this comes at a point in time where the industry, rightly so, by the way, is getting quite muscular in the way it looks at the companies that it invests in, the way it presents itself to its investors. And I think these are all very good things. These are to be supported. This is something that is good for the industry overall. But frankly, whilst they do that, I think equally we want to be sure that they are holding themselves to the same standards that they are holding others to. And in that respect, I think this is an excellent campaign that you launched. Now, Fund Boards Council is 2 years old. We were launched on the back of the asset management market study in the UK, where for those of you who follow these sorts of things will know that there was a strong feeling from the regulator that there was an absence of governance, an absence of transparency, and an absence of non-executive directors on fund boards who would provide some of this oversight. That's really where we got our start, and we've moved on since then, and we maybe can talk a little bit about that. Our work breaks down, I think, into two key areas. One is very much around what we would call costs and charges, so assessment of value, really, from a UK context. But I should quickly add that this is not just a UK-only issue. It's one that we're going to see and hear a lot more about in other jurisdictions as well. The other piece is, I suspect, the bit we may want to talk a little bit about as well, is around effectiveness of boards. How well are boards conducting themselves? How well are the directors on these boards, whether they're executive directors or non-executive directors? How well are they conducting themselves? And how effective are they being in discharging their roles? So that's how I see the work of FBC, broadly broken up into these two key themes.
Yeah, fantastic. And thanks for your kind words about the campaign for better governance. We did feel like it's a really important issue. So first of all, tell us about your work and findings on the assessments of value. I feel like there has been a lot of confusion in the industry around this.
Yes, there's been confusion in the industry because I think for the very first time, the regulator was not as prescriptive in what it wanted the industry to do. It basically set a broad framework and said, we want you to think about these 7 key areas or these 7 key themes. And we then want you to go away and establish how best you want to represent your work in and around those 7 key themes. And I have to say, it's proven to be very difficult for a lot of firms because as an industry, and I say this with the best will in the world, we are very used to being told what to do in a highly regulated environment. There's been a great deal of, if you follow these rules and if you do this in particular, i.e. a little bit of box ticking, you'll be fine, as opposed to having to think about some of these issues. So I'm not surprised that there is a general sense there's been a little bit of, well, we're not entirely sure what we're supposed to do. The other area which I think has come up a little bit is if the purpose of assessment of value is for the end investor, or is for the benefit of the end investor, to what extent has the end investor engaged with the process? And I think it's a very fair question to ask. And I think it's become abundantly clear to us, and indeed I think it's become abundantly clear to the regulator as well, that the extent of engagement that end investors are going to have with the assessment of value process, or indeed the assessment of value report, is going to be relatively small. But I wouldn't be disheartened by that. In fact, if anything, I think the real value of the assessment of value process is less so in the report per se, but in the undertaking of the exercise that asset management companies, and more to the point, their boards have to do, and the impact that that's beginning to have. And certainly, as through the work that FPC is doing, we're starting to see some very, very positive changes being brought about on the internal bits of it that are not visible to you and I, and certainly not visible to the end client, but hopefully will result in, over a period of time. And look, we see this as a bit of a 3 to 4 year exercise rather than something that's going to manifest itself in 1 year itself. Some very positive outcomes, whether in the headlines of fees, but also just in terms of the way the business is being run. So confusing, yes. Complicated, yes. Difficult, yes. But I think ultimately we will see, when we look back on this over 3-5 years, we'll see this was a very important exercise brought about by the FCA, and one that we certainly feel is going to be for the overall good of the marketplace.
When we first were introduced a few years ago, we were talking about diversity on fund boards. Can you talk a bit about the work that Fund Boards Council's carried out around that, and how has diversity improved on fund boards?
Really important point. D&I in its wider context is a really big issue on boards generally, and now increasingly on fund boards. But before we talk about what's happened or what needs to happen, I just want to be absolutely clear. There are many different types of boards within the fund management business. So if you think about a PLC company, they have a board at the top. But fund management companies have lots of other boards. In most cases, historically, these were internal boards, or really more like executive committees, not really run as boards as you and I would understand them. Most of them didn't even have non-executive directors. So in that sense, a lot of the work around D&I that we talk about today within the fund industry, and especially on boards, is a relatively new thing. The more technical the boards, if you think about the ACD or the AFM board, the boards that we're currently talking about from an assessment of value process or a market study process, these are highly technical boards. These are boards which have very particular functions, and they have to meet certain requirements from a regulatory standpoint, and now increasingly from a governance standpoint. So I think when we talk about diversity, we've got to be very clear about what bit of diversity are we looking at. And I think the one thing that the industry has lacked, amongst the many things it's lacked, is diversity in terms of thought. There is too many people who've come from exactly the same backgrounds and have worked in exactly the same industry and have done exactly the same thing, who tend to have historically populated these boards. So just as much as there is a need for diversity, whether it's in terms of gender or race or any of the other things that we talk about, I think the one area, and by the way, they're all very important, the one area that I think that certainly the regulator is pushing for, and one I would like to see more work being done, is how do we make sure that from a thinking process, a thought process, from the way boards think about the work they do, we need a bigger platform than we currently have. That's not to say that that any of those others are not important. I think they're all important, but sometimes you've got to pick a battle to fight. And certainly this is one I think fund boards can be accused of fairly for not having done enough work on.
There's also been a bigger focus on culture over the past year, corporate culture, due to the pandemic. What have you noticed in the fund industry?
It's a huge issue. Culture and purpose is how we would sort of frame this conversation. And we recently had a meeting where we invited the regulators to come and join the conversation. And a point that struck me at the time and has stayed with me is, if asset management, and I think this to some extent leads to the work that you guys are doing, is if the industry doesn't understand what its culture needs to be and what its purpose is, then frankly it needs to ask itself some pretty tough questions. So on the one hand, it's really risen in terms of the agenda. It's at the top of the agenda. The trick is, how do we measure some of this stuff? And how do we calibrate it? And how do we evaluate it? That I think is harder to do, particularly, and again, I come back to this point about the more technical end of the fund boards. I suppose the best way to describe it would be to say, you know when it doesn't exist, because then it's very apparent. I don't see this as a one solution or some one thing that needs to be changed. It's about the way the board thinks about issues. It's about the way the board acts upon those thoughts that it has about those issues. It's fundamentally about the way you conduct yourself. And particularly within a board environment, this has become hugely important. And I'd like to just quickly put in a word for the non-executive directors. Most fund management firms in this country have not had non-executive directors at their ACD level. In fact, I'd say the vast majority didn't till they were forced to by the regulator. Now, we've only had them going anywhere between 18 and 24 months in most cases. And again, we've collected lots of data on this, and there's been lots of discussion about this. The narrative, the tenor, the quality of the discussion has started to change quite markedly. And I think that's going to have a really big impact on culture as well. Come back and ask me in a couple of years' time, and I'll tell you whether it's really had an impact.
Okay, I'll definitely hold you to that. Also, culture is extremely difficult to measure. How do you look at it and analyse it? Or indeed, is there a way to analyse corporate culture?
It's a tough one, but I think there is. I think we won't measure it in isolation. I think we'll measure it against other things that we will look at. And the most obvious ways, and this is in terms of outcomes, and I think the most obvious way around it will be, how do you treat your colleagues? How do you treat your customers? How do you, it's those sorts of things that I think are going to be measured. So I think it's going to be outcome based. It's going to be based around issues not immediately measurable in the boardroom, although I also believe there are ways to do that. Look, it's a tricky one, and I think it's one that's going to have to be evaluated over a period of time. And the way we think about it today may not be the way we'll end up thinking about it in a few years' time. But I think as long as we can keep at the front and center of the purpose of what this industry is about, is to provide positive outcomes for its investors and its customers. And if we can keep that centrally in focus, then I think things like culture and purpose will become much easier conversations to have, and hopefully over a period of time will become much easier to measure as well.
What are you working towards as well on the Fund Board Council? And what would you like to see the industry embrace in terms of improving governance within the investment management sector?
So we hold ourselves up to this idea that we want to be there to support positive outcomes in terms of investment governance. That's fundamentally what FPC has been set up to do. And it comes back to the first 2 points we talked about right at the outset. It's about how do we ensure around the issue of value, whether you define that value in terms of fees, whether you define that value in terms of performance, or you do it in terms of a combination of that and several other factors. How does that remain a centerpiece of the way governance is thought about? And I think we want to be very much at the center of that conversation. And then the other aspect of it is the bit we've just talked about, which is about effectiveness. And how do we ensure that the way asset management companies and their boards conduct themselves are equal to the way they want others to conduct themselves? And I think this goes to the heart of your campaign, is if we hold others to a certain standard, if, for example, we as the industry are going to take a view on gender, on other boards, in terms of boards of companies you put your money in, the fund manager puts their money in, then surely the fund manager should hold itself to the same standard on gender, or indeed anything else, on its own boards. So I think that to me seems like the most obvious place for us to have a role in. And I think as ESG and the idea of ESG becomes so much more important, and as everyone says, it's no longer going to be just one factor, but bedded into everything we do, then I think that becomes very much an important part for us to play a role in as well.
Yes, very important. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I've got all of my questions. So thank you very much for your time, Shiv. It was great talking to you.
Natalie, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. It was a pleasure.